There is a kind of man who measures his own worth by the sound he makes. This is the story of a blacksmith who spent his whole life believing that the ringing of his hammer was proof he still mattered, and who had to lose that sound entirely before he understood what it had actually been protecting him from. In a village built along a river crossing, there was a blacksmith whose forge sat at the very center of things, close enough to the road that every traveler passing through heard the steady rhythm of his hammer against the anvil before they ever saw the village itself. For as long as anyone could remember, that sound had been the village's heartbeat. Farmers set their mornings by it. Children fell asleep to its distant echo in the evenings. The blacksmith himself had come to believe, somewhere over the decades, that the sound was not simply a byproduct of his work, but the entire point of it. As long as the hammer rang out from his forge, he was still useful. He still belonged at the center of the village he had spent his life serving. He had built his identity so completely around that rhythm that he rarely thought to question it. Other men in the village measured their years by harvests or by children raised. The blacksmith measured his by the unbroken sound of his own hammer, day after day, decade after decade, a noise so constant that its absence, even for an afternoon, felt to him like something had gone quietly wrong with the world. He was, in his prime, extraordinarily strong, broad through the shoulders in a way that made even the heaviest hammers feel light in his grip, and he took pride not only in the quality of his work, but in the sheer volume of it. He forged plowshares and horseshoes and hinges long after his competitors in neighboring villages had closed their forges for the evening, driven not by necessity, but by a restlessness that made silence feel, to him, like a kind of failure. If the hammering stopped, even briefly, he found himself inventing tasks to fill the quiet, reshaping tools that needed no reshaping, sharpening blades that were already sharp. Simply so, the forge would keep making noise. As the years wore on, though, his hands began to betray him in ways he refused, for a long time, to acknowledge. A stiffness crept into his knuckles that made the mornings slower than they used to be. His grip, once strong enough to hold a glowing bar of iron steady through 100 strikes without tiring, began to falter after only a few dozen. He compensated in ways only he noticed at first, resting more often between strikes, choosing lighter hammers than he once would have used, working through a low, persistent ache that he never once mentioned to anyone in the village. He told himself these were small adjustments, the ordinary cost of age that any craftsman eventually paid. What he could not tell himself, no matter how he tried, was that the rhythm coming from his forge had begun, almost imperceptibly, to change. The strikes came slightly slower now. The pauses between them stretched a little longer. Anyone who had grown up beside that sound their whole life might not have consciously noticed the shift, but they felt it, the way a person feels a change in a familiar heartbeat without being able to name what's different. The blacksmith noticed the change more than anyone because he was the one causing it, and he fought against it with a stubbornness that bordered on desperation. On mornings when his hands ached too badly to grip the hammer properly, he forced himself to work anyway, gritting through the pain rather than resting, because resting meant silence, and silence, in his mind, meant that the village would begin to wonder whether he was still needed at all. It was on one of these mornings, pushing through a pain sharper than any he had allowed himself to admit before, that his hand finally gave out entirely. The hammer slipped from fingers that simply would not close around the handle any longer, and it fell to the floor of the forge with a single dull clang, followed by nothing. No second strike, no rhythm to catch it and carry it forward. Just the sudden total silence of a forge that had not gone quiet in longer than most of the villagers had been alive. He sat with that silence for a long while, unable, at first, to make himself pick the hammer back up, staring at the tool lying useless on the packed dirt floor as if it belonged to someone else entirely. It was not only his hand that had failed him, he realized, sitting alone in the stillness of his own forge for the first time he could remember. It was the belief he had built his entire life around, the idea that his worth was measured in noise, in output, in the unbroken sound of usefulness. Without the hammering, he did not know in that silence who he actually was. Word spread quickly through the village that the forge had gone quiet, and for the first time in his life, the blacksmith understood what it felt like to be the subject of the kind of worry he had always imagined silence would bring. Neighbors stopped by not to place orders, but simply to ask how he was. Children who had grown up falling asleep to the distant sound of his hammer asked their parents with real concern why the sound had stopped. He found, to his surprise, that none of them seemed to think less of him for it. If anything, the silence had made them notice him more directly than the noise ever had. Among those who came by was a young man from a neighboring farm, the son of a family whose plow the blacksmith had repaired more times than he could count over the years. The young man had always shown a quiet curiosity about the forge, lingering at the doorway sometimes to watch the work, though he had never asked to learn the trade himself, and the blacksmith had never once thought to offer. In the silence of those difficult weeks, though, the young man began coming by more often, at first simply to sit with the old blacksmith, and eventually to ask carefully whether he might be taught. The blacksmith's first instinct was to refuse. He could not properly demonstrate the work anymore, could not grip a hammer with any confidence, and the idea of teaching without being able to show, hand over hand, the exact rhythm and force of a proper strike felt to him like admitting a failure he was not ready to name aloud. But the young man kept coming, and in the absence of anything else to fill the silence of his days, the blacksmith eventually relented, if only to have something to do with his afternoons besides sitting alone with his own unfamiliar quiet. What began as a reluctant arrangement became, over the following months, something the blacksmith had not expected. He could not swing the hammer himself any longer, but he found that he could watch closely in a way his own decades of constant hammering had never allowed him time to do. He could hear, in the young man's early uneven strikes, exactly where the rhythm was wrong, exactly which angle produced a hollow, uncertain sound instead of the clean ring of metal struck true. He began guiding with his voice instead of his hands, correcting a grip here, adjusting a stance there, describing in words the feeling he had never once had to put into language before, because his hands had always simply known. It was slow, careful work, nothing like the constant driving noise he had spent his life believing was the whole point of the forge. But as the weeks passed, the young man's strikes grew steadier, and the rhythm coming from the forge, though still learning, began to carry something of the same shape the blacksmith had spent 40 years perfecting, passed along now not through his own hands, but through patient words spoken into careful silence between each strike. He came to understand, sitting quietly beside the anvil, he could no longer work himself, that the noise he had spent his whole life protecting had never actually been the source of his worth at all. It had only ever been the sound of something he already knew being expressed. The knowledge itself, it turned out, could still be given away in complete silence, one careful correction at a time, and somehow that felt more valuable than any unbroken rhythm of hammer strikes ever had. The anvil in the center of the forge still bears a smooth, worn hollow near its edge, struck so many thousands of times by the blacksmith's own hand over the decades that the metal wore down into a shape unlike anywhere else on its surface. These days, it is the young man's hammer that strikes that same worn spot again and again, filling the forge with a rhythm the old blacksmith taught him without ever lifting a hammer himself, while the old man sits nearby in the quiet he once feared, listening and finally at peace with the sound of someone else's work.